Disclaimer. The views expressed in this video, as well as the content and images, are for review purposes only. If you are interested in what we are reviewing, please pick up a book and form your own opinions. What I like and dislike, others may not like or dislike. Reading is a very individual thing. If you do pick up the book, please leave a review, as this not only helps out authors financially, but is essential to helping us improve our skills. Furthermore, if you'd like to support me and my channel, you can follow the links down in the descriptions to my own works and my own books. And you can also help out by liking or commenting below and subscribing to the channel. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This week I intended to do an indie book, but as it so happens I ran into a snag. If you pay attention to my reviews, you'll notice 9 out of the last 10 books I've reviewed fit neatly into the category of sci-fi or fantasy. This is mostly because I rather like magic and lasers, but with all good things it's possible to get burnt out. Instead of regaling you all with a review of James Herriot's works, one of my favorite authors because he's wholesome and funny, I know I'm weird, I like both wholesome and darkness, and I have no good explanation. I've decided to step out of my comfort zone, and I asked one of my mutuals on Discord for some recommendations. So congratulations, you're all about to hear a review of a Western published over a century ago. Now we can all feel old as I get into my shameless self-promotion. I'm doing another giveaway, this one of my second book, Hapless Homesteader. It begins on May 17th and ends on May 26th. If you've ever been interested in what the world would be like if everyone but you died, this may be the story for you. It's a post-apocalyptic story without zombies, just a single shut-in trying to survive in the pristine ruins of a once mighty civilization. And with that out of the way, let's move on to the recap. So this week we're reviewing Riders of the Purple Sage by Zane Grey. I'm still a little murky on the story, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So we start our story with Jane Witherstein, looking out over the sage-filled frontier outside her home. After a lot of scene setting, she's approached by Bishop Tull. Tull is a Mormon bishop, and is here to call out Jane's companion, Venters, who just so happens to be a Gentile. Tull is under the impression that Jane might be shacking up with this rider, and with all the subtlety of an incel yelling at an e-thought, has his men drag Venters out and tells him to leave town and be poor somewhere else, or he can be beat within an inch of his life, and then he can be poor somewhere else. To which Venters responds, "Try me, polygamist." Jane can't bring herself to take a side in this, and just does as she's told, and everything looks to be coming up Tull, until the infamous gunman Lassiter shows up and scares the bishop off, along with his men. Lassiter is notorious for his hatred of Mormons, but it turns out he's come here because he's heard Jane, who is a Mormon, could take him to the grave of a girl named Millie. Jane agrees to take him the next day, and when asked, he refuses to elaborate as to why he wants to go to this grave. Knowing that the bishop and his men may come back, both Lassiter and Venters head out into the sage to spend the night. Venters notices rustlers and sneaky Mormons going about less than wholesome business, and instead of doing his job as one of Jane's riders, he just heads to his little sleeping hole where he left his 2 dogs. He goes to sleep with his doggos and his battered old horse, and awakens the next morning and finds Lassiter on his way back to the ranch. The two become quick friends over a handshake, the Old West being a very weird place if this actually happened, and the two start swapping stories. The conversation turns to the bishop and what's going on with Venters and Jane. It turns out Venters has been practicing shooting nearby so he can kill the bishop, but because of Jane's pleading, he gave up the guns he carries with him at all times, and that's why he was basically caught with his pants down by the bishop's men. It must be hard having a job where your boss actively discourages you from taking around the tools of your trade, being a cowboy and all, and being disassociated with your guns, but pretty girls have convinced men to do dumber things. There are 2 problems that the nearby town of Cottonwood has with Jane. One is that she's pretty, rich, and unmarried, and the bishop really wants to make her his 3rd wife for several reasons, but the biggest one being to get hold of her ranch. Number 2 is her tolerance and acceptance of non-Mormons, especially Venters and Lassiter. I can just see the bishop crying into his pillow, cursing those dirty Gentiles for having 1/3 of all the women he wants. Maybe he should talk to his mother so she can remind him he has wives at home, as the meme goes. Lassiter and Venter return to Jane's house, and Jane immediately takes Lassiter to see Millie's grave. At the grave, Lassiter tells Jane that Millie was abducted years ago and he's been hunting for her ever since.
Jane tells him that she gave birth to a child after being forced to become a Mormon wife in the town of Cottonwoods. Then she died shortly after. I believe it's here that Jane decides to herself that she's going to try to soften Lassiter's disposition of her people, these being the same people who were about to flog her last boyfriend because of his negative views on polygamy, more specifically the bishop's polygamy. Cutting to the former boyfriend, it turns out local rustlers have taken one of Jane's herds. Venters takes the best of Jane's horses and rides off to find them. He finds the missing herd and some of the rustlers and proceeds to kill one of the rustlers and critically wounds another. The wounded one turns out to be the infamous masked rider, the second in command of the local rustlers. Venters is watching him die when he notices something is wrong. It turns out that he is actually a she. Venters is suddenly filled with compassion for his dirty, murderous ways and has a minor breakdown because he thinks he's killed a woman. The woman doesn't die but wakes up in shock. Venters, feeling guilty, sets up camp and does his best to keep her comfortable, sure she'll die before the morning, sparing not a thought for the other person he literally just killed a little bit ago. Back to the ranch, and one of the other riders, whose name wasn't important enough for me to remember, tells Jane that things are about to get much worse, and that it's the bishop's intention to break her will by causing problems around her ranch. Jane goes to town to get a better idea of what's going on, and she sees her fellow Mormons living comfortably and the Gentiles living in poverty. She visits several of her Gentile friends and tries to persuade them she's not trying to make their lives harder. She convinces one of them, who is dying, to come stay with her and bring her daughter Faye. And this is specifically because Jane thinks that Faye is an adorable little child. It is Jane's hope to use this child in her plans to soften Lassiter. And that's where I will leave off the recap. This is more or less a quarter of the way into the book, and there's a lot I left out, so feel free to pick it up. So let's get into what I like. This section's also going to be a little bit vague, mostly because what I like is the early tone of the book. It's very calming and easygoing despite the rather harsh things that are going on. The way the scene is set just kind of strikes a chord with me. The early descriptions put me in a very tranquil state of mind. I usually don't like books that are very heavy on descriptions, but the scene setting was very soothing and made for an enjoyable experience. A little bit less vague, this felt like a less conventional Western story, at least as far as Westerns that I'm familiar with. It's not about bringing law and order to a lawless town or outlaws being outlaws. It's a religious and social conflict. The main character is torn between her religion, her morals, and what she wants. The whole thing feels like a long struggle session. And there's a weird sense of futility to the main plot, mostly because of the main character's indecision and constant drama. I can understand why she doesn't want to leave, but at some point you just have to say you need to leave. But that's a whole different subject. It's also nice to see Mormons in a Western. It's not something I've seen very often, especially considering the little-known Mormon wars that the U.S. fought, and if you don't know about those, you should definitely look them up. The history of the Mormons is fairly interesting, and I would like to see more Westerns featuring them. The politics of the book are probably the most interesting part, which is why I found it rather disappointing how little there seemed to be of them. There's also some wonderfully gritty darkness here and there. A prime example is Lassiter's blind horse. Apparently some people unable to do what they wanted to Lassiter blinded his horse in an absolutely horrific way. It's not the only grim bit in the book, but there are far fewer than I would like. This is probably due more to the time it was written than anything else. So let's get into my dislikes. And before I get into this, I want to make it clear I don't dislike the book. I just have more to say about what I didn't like. So I'm not sure if this was the right choice to start Westerns with. I didn't sit and measure it out, but most of this book feels like dialogue. Several events I would have liked to see happen are only talked about by the other characters. A good example of this is when Lassiter goes to town and literally disembowels somebody with his gun. This is a very important part, and it all takes place when Jane passes out. We see nothing of this showdown. It's just 1 minute Jane is awake and trying to stop Lassiter from being a force of nature. She passes out, then she wakes up and Lassiter is stitching up his bullet holes. And I just wanted to yell, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, Mr. Author, something amazing just happened and I'm missing it because some woman swooned?" I really feel cheated by this. It felt like I sat through hours of dialogue for some grand showdown and all I got was, "Well, that just happened, now let's move on." It's not like there's no action, but I'm a little bitter about what was missed. Speaking of that, let's move to the B plot. We had a nice little bit where Venters shoots the masked rider, but this quickly turns into a story of Venters falling in love with this girl he shot for rustling the cattle of his employer. I was hoping for some more conflict between the two, especially after we find out she's the daughter, but not really, of the head rustler. I feel like we missed an opportunity for an enemies to lovers situation. Instead, we got near instant love, and it feels really unearned. And I really want to harp on this, because this girl, Bess, which Venters rescues by shooting her and not committing to the double tap, is supposedly innocent. And I don't mean of cattle rustling. She's completely guilty of that. I mean, she's an innocent soul. She's the daughter of the most infamous man, barring Lassiter of course, in the area. And she's been raised among criminals her whole life, pretty much for the last 18 years. How is she innocent? They attempt to explain this, but I have trouble believing the explanation, and I'm not going to put it in here. If you want to know, you're going to have to pick up the book. Maybe it's just me, but I found the story a little murky. Not to the point where I couldn't tell what was going on, but I did have trouble understanding the characters' motives. It also could be that I wasn't sure why Venters was upset that he'd shot a woman when he was chasing off rustlers. I would have thought with his job, being a cowboy and all, this wouldn't be the first time he'd shot somebody. Then I wasn't sure why he decided to help her. Maybe have a little bit of a breakdown over the fact that he killed somebody he wasn't intending to, but she was still cattle rustling. Then there's this problem with Lassiter. And Lassiter is presented as this real hardened killer, this hunter of Mormons. But as the story goes, he softens way too easily for me to properly believe it. Much of this makes me believe I wasn't the intended audience for this book. So let's get into my thoughts. As I said, I'm not sure I'm the intended audience. This feels much more like a romantic book. And I don't mean just romance. There's a lot of romance in this book. I mean romantic in the grander sense. It's very flowery and dramatic. There's a lot of poetic dialogue. And there's a bit more description than I would have liked. But with a bit more action and grit, I really could have liked this story. A little bit more show of some of the grittier things that happen. That being said, this was originally published in 1912, much closer to when Lord of the Rings was published than our current time, and that was a lot of description. There's a lot about writing at that time. People really liked their description. And with this being written so long ago, I can't exactly talk to the author about it. Not that my opinions would probably sway him. Zane Grey is a fairly popular author from what I understand. Given its age, I may have a modernist bias. With the writing styles of a century ago aside, I have a little trouble with the female characters. It's not the same problem I have with modern female characters where they're either thoughts or men with everything but the wedding tackle. The women in this story lack grit. And it's possible it's my own personal bias growing up in Appalachia around Appalachian women, but most of the women I know in rural areas have a great deal more grit. They're a great deal harder than what I saw portrayed here, and it gives me pause. I can't completely hate them, but I can't really like them either. This book did teach me something important about word choice and lexicon. English is a wonderful language, and how it works and its different meanings almost feel like magic sometimes. The problem comes when a word becomes so tied to bedroom activities that it's almost impossible to hear without that association. I'm not going to say the word here because, as unoffensive as it actually is, there's no telling what YouTube will do anymore. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure if the word in question had the same double meaning when the book was written, and I'm not about to pollute my search history trying to find out. I really don't want to see the ads in the Amazon results. So the question remains, will I continue with the genre? I'll be honest, I'm not sure. While I was put off by some of the more romantic aspects of the story, I see some real potential in it. I've even been informed there are funny westerns, and I do love a good comedy, almost as much as I love a good tragedy. And with that being said, I wish you all good luck.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to my review. If you enjoyed it, you can find others on my YouTube, BitChute, and Odyssey channels. If you are an independent author and would like a chance at having a review, I have master lists on Minds, Gab, and Twitter pinned at the top of my feed. Please leave your book name, the way you would like readers to contact you, and a place where you can be reached and your work can be found. Thank you.